Dust rolled through Red Hollow like a restless spirit, curling around the broken fences, the empty troughs, and the bleached bones of a town that had forgotten how to care. The saloon doors swung open on their tired hinges, creaking like an old warning. Every head turned for a heartbeat before turning away again, pretending not to see her. Eliza Hart stood barefoot on the cracked boards, her once blue dress faded to the color of despair. Her auburn hair hung in loose, tangled curls that brushed her shoulders, streaked with the dirt of too many sleepless nights. Her eyes, clear once as the sky over her father's ranch, were dull now, rimmed red from loss. They'd taken everything. The sheriff, slick with whiskey and cowardice, had signed away her family's land to cover debts that weren't hers. The banker, a rat-faced man with gold teeth, had taken her horse and her father's saddle, collateral, he called it. Even the townsfolk, the same ones who'd once eaten at her family's table, turned their faces away when she passed. No one had lifted a finger when they put her off her land. She had buried her father 3 days ago on a cold, wind-bitten morning. The preacher hadn't shown up, said he was too busy. There was no one else to speak the prayers, so she'd said them herself, voice trembling as she dropped the last handful of dust onto the pine box. When it was done, she just stood there, her fingers still clutching the edge of the shovel, feeling the weight of silence pressing down from every side. She hadn't planned on coming back to town. But hunger had a way of changing plans. She needed food, maybe work, something to keep from fading away with the wind. The saloon was the only place still open, its windows glowing with the flicker of cheap lanterns. Inside, the laughter was harsh, the kind that never reached the eyes. She moved through the haze of smoke, every step loud against the silence that followed her. Then a voice from the corner said, "Ain't that the Hart girl? Thought she'd be long gone by now." A few chuckles followed, sharp as spurs. Someone else added, "Ain't got a ranch, ain't got a horse, reckon she'll be lookin' for a man to feed her next." Eliza kept her head high, but her hands trembled as she approached the bar. The barkeep, an old friend of her father's once, didn't meet her eyes. "Best you go, Eliza," he muttered. "Ain't nothin' here for you." She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound died before it began. There was nowhere to go, and no one left to listen. Then came the creak of boot leather. Slow, deliberate steps crossed the room until they stopped just behind her. "You're Eliza Hart," said a voice. Low, steady, edged with something cold and dangerous. She turned. The man before her was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long duster that had seen miles of bad road. A faint scar traced down his jaw, catching the lantern light. His hat shadowed his eyes, but she could feel them, sharp, unyielding, the kind of gaze that stripped away lies. "Who's askin'?" she said, her voice brittle but brave. He rested a hand on the counter, and the barkeep went still as stone. "Name's Colt Avery," he said simply. "Used to know your pa. Rode with him once, back when men still had honor in this town." The words hit her like a blow she hadn't expected. Her father had never spoken much about his past. "If you knew him," she said quietly, "then you know he's gone. And everything he built died with him." Colt's eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "I heard," he said. "That's why I came." She gave a hollow laugh. "Came for what? There's nothing left to take." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "You're wrong about that. There's still you." Something in his tone, firm, not pitying, cut through the fog in her chest. She stared at him, trying to understand. "You don't belong here," he said, his gaze sweeping over the saloon, the sneering faces, the stale air. "This town's poison. It'll kill what's left of you if you stay." She straightened, crossing her arms. "And where exactly am I supposed to go, Mr. Avery? They took my land, my horse, my home. I don't even have a bed to sleep in tonight." He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You do now." Before she could ask, he tipped his hat toward the door. "You're coming home with me." The room went silent. Even the drunks stopped whispering. Eliza's breath caught between disbelief and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in days: hope. "Why?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Colt's mouth curved in a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Because your pa once saved my life," he said. "And because I don't like seeing good people left in the dirt." He turned toward the door, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. For a moment, Eliza didn't move. Then, with the weight of the past pressing hard behind her and the promise of something unknown ahead, she followed him out into the dying light. The sun dipped low, painting the desert in fire. And for the first time since her world had fallen apart, Eliza Hart felt something stir inside her chest. Something like the beginning of a new dawn. The first night at Colt Avery's ranch was quiet. Too quiet for someone used to the restless sounds of Red Hollow. The wind hummed through the cottonwoods, and the creak of the old windmill sounded almost like breathing. Eliza sat on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. She stared at the horizon, wondering how she'd ended up here, on a stranger's land, in a stranger's house, with a man whose past was written in scars. Colt had shown her to a small room at the end of the hall, plain but clean, with a sturdy bed and a window that faced the open range. "Ain't much," he'd said, "but it's yours." Then he'd left her to rest, his footsteps fading into the dark. In the days that followed, Eliza learned that Colt was a man of few words but unshakable purpose. He rose with the dawn, fed the horses, checked the fences, and worked until the sun burned the sweat off his back. He never asked her to help, but she did anyway. Mending fences came as natural to her as breathing. Soon, she was right beside him, driving nails, her hands blistered but steady. At first, they spoke only about the land, weather, soil, and cattle. But as the days stretched into weeks, the silence between them softened. He told her about his past, little by little. How he'd once been a lawman, until the town's greed chewed him up and spat him out. How he'd wandered for years before settling here, building a life out of dust and grit. And she told him about her father. How the land had meant everything to him. How she still dreamed of riding her horse, Shadow, across the open fields she'd loved as a girl. Colt listened, really listened, in a way no one else ever had. One morning, she woke to find a saddled horse waiting outside the barn. A dark bay mare with a white blaze and intelligent eyes. "She's yours," Colt said simply. "Found her half-starved outside town. Figured she deserved better." Eliza ran her hand along the mare's neck, her throat tightening. "You didn't have to." "I know," he replied, meeting her eyes. "But I wanted to." Something changed after that. The ranch began to feel less like a place of refuge and more like a home. Eliza started tending the small garden, cooking their meals, and keeping the books. At night, they'd sit by the fire, he with his coffee, she with her mending, and sometimes, when the silence grew too long, he'd tell her about the stars. But peace never lasts long in the Wild West. One afternoon, Colt rode into Red Hollow to trade supplies. Eliza insisted on going with him. The town went still the moment they stepped off their horses. Whispers followed them through the street. The banker was there, puffed up and smug, standing outside his office. "Well, if it ain't the fallen Hart girl," he sneered. "Didn't think you'd crawl back." Before Eliza could speak, Colt stepped forward. "Careful," he said, voice calm but laced with steel. "That's Mrs. Hart to you." A murmur ran through the crowd. The banker blinked. "You can't just." "I can," Colt interrupted. "And I will. The Hart Ranch is back under her name. Anyone who says otherwise can settle it with me." The way he said it, flat, final, left no room for argument. His hand never even touched his gun. He didn't have to. By the next morning, word had spread. Folks who'd once turned their backs on Eliza suddenly found their manners again. Some even came offering help, supplies, old debts repaid. Red Hollow had always bowed to whoever had the strength to stand tall, and now they saw that strength in her. Weeks later, Eliza stood on her porch, watching the sunrise paint the fields gold. Colt stepped up beside her, his hand brushing hers. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. She smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Not anymore." For the first time in her life, the land ahead felt truly hers again. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd fought to reclaim it. With Colt beside her, the past didn't hurt so much. It just reminded her how far she'd come. And as the sun climbed higher over the wild hills of Red Hollow, Eliza Hart, once broken, now unyielding, finally came home.